particular, that God's decision to allow human victory from time to time is actually a manifestation of something approximating humility, or at least mercy. But humility is an interesting take on it.
Well, it's also connected to Paul's image of how Christ hands himself over and allows himself to be defeated by men and therefore conquers sin, which is man's enemy. It's the same paradox where God enters into that dynamic with people
and loses to win.
And willingly loses.
Yeah, well, okay, so the first thing I would say is that's a really interesting analogy. I can't, it's a complicated enough question so that I can't go beyond, I don't think I can go beyond the question actually, because it's so complicated that I don't think I can formulate it any better than you already did. Like, it's an interesting string of ideas. I'd have to play with it a while to see. It does shed an interesting light on why God is amenable to negotiation in the Old Testament, which is really a strange, as you pointed out, it's really a strange thing. It's like, this is omnipotent God who obviously can do whatever he wants, and yet he can be bargained with. And that also opens up the question of why. Like, your hypothesis is, well, if you don't let the little rat win now and then they get dejected and quit playing. And that's a pretty good observation. If people don't get to win now and then, that's kind of what happens to Cain. God says, well, you're not playing a straight game, that's why you're not winning. But I don't know. There's an intimation in the Old Testament, and I think it's more developed in the New Testament, maybe not, that the straighter the game you play, the more likely you are to win. And so maybe part of the reason that God lets Abraham bargain and even Jacob is because they've started to play very straight games. And so maybe you do win in your wrestling with God if you play a straight game. I think the reason that's true is because that's actually why we would define it as a straight game. Now, then we could speak psychologically again. I think that what we've come to recognize as a straight game is the game that in the broadest number of situations across the widest range of time spans is most likely to produce a positive outcome. And that's actually the grounds for our sense of ethics, that it's really practical.
Not to belabor it too much, because there was an interesting insight from Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, where God sets himself up as the benevolent antagonist so as to accelerate the game.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting idea. There is hints, I would say, throughout the biblical stories that the reason that God tolerates Satan, let's say, is because without an adversary, you're soft. And that's tied in with the notion that life is something like a moral struggle. That's the fundamental essence of being, a moral struggle. Now, I think that's phenomenologically a reasonable observation. Maybe other people don't experience it that way, but it seems to me, like within my own experience, that that's accurate. Now, I don't know what that says about the fundamental nature of reality. But I had a vision at one point that I was in a ring with Satan, actually, believe it or not. And it was like a Roman Colosseum. And, I was rather upset to find myself there, but I won. And I asked God afterwards why he would do such a thing. And his answer was, he knew I could win. That's interesting, because, I don't know what to make of that. Believe me, I have no idea what to make of that. But the idea was that if you're trying to encourage someone rather than protect them, because those are really different things, right? To protect someone isn't to make them strong. To encourage them is to make them strong. Then you set them a series of challenges right at the point where they may win. And maybe you could make a case that that's what you do if you really care for someone. Now, I know that I'm not saying that interpretation is correct. But there's something, you definitely with your children, when you're wrestling with them, say, when you're playing with them, you push them to the limit of their ability. because otherwise they don't transcend their current abilities.